Power creep is a commonly recurring phenomenon in video games used to describe the gradual unbalancing of a game due to successive releases of new content, leaving previous content underpowered or obsolete. It also refers to a gradual increase in power within a video game, causing it to become unstable. I talked about it quite often in the past, especially during my tirade on overloaded champions back in 2021, but this video will be discussing something a bit different. Over the course of a season, champions get buffed and nerfed usually in accordance to what Riot feels like is worth looking at for that moment of time. Even though players complain about how the balanced team can't seem to make up their mind over who they want strong or weak, that's actually intentional. Metas are never meant to last forever. What ends up happening is Riot buffs the champion, waits a while, then nerfs them before buffing a different champion and repeating the cycle over and over again. Contrary to popular belief, they know exactly what they're doing. But among the 160-something champions, a handful of them have been known to receive buffs over and over again, yet still don't improve in win rate all that much. A short while back, I made a video on Always Strong Champions, which was a follow-up to the Always Weak Champions video from last year. The difference between this video and those two is that these champions are seemingly always weak, even though they actually get buffed a lot. That's because of the rather ambiguous nature of power creep in League of Legends, making it so in spite of those buffs, those champions are still falling behind the curve. For today, we'll be discussing power creep champions and how they remain weak even though they've been getting buffs over and over. On the video thumbnail you see Teemo, Vegard, and Malphite, a weird combination of champions. Seeing as how this is a very specific category, I actually want to take a moment to look through each of their version histories to show you what I mean, starting with Teemo. From what I can tell, Teemo has to be the most buffed champion in the game that still barely manages to hold more than a 50% win rate in Diamond Plus. Scrolling all the way down to 5.20 almost 8 years ago, let's go up the list. In version 5.20, his ultimate was buffed to activate faster and replenish in supply faster. Then in 6.1, he got more attack damage, more accessible stealth, and a longer cast range on his shrooms. Then in 6.9, his Q and ultimate both got a cheaper mana cost and the mushroom refresh timer was made even shorter. Then in 724B, he got a tiny nerf as a result of 722 overbuffing his base stats in line with the other champs. But moving on, version 8.9 saw a buff to his base mana and mana regeneration. Then in 9.18, his mushrooms could bounce off each other infinitely, extending his cast range as well as allowing him to store up to 5 shrooms at rank 3. Then in 10.6, while not really that big a buff, it's still a buff, he does more damage to monsters and has a longer blind against them too. Then in 11.7, he got 2 more seconds on his passive, which is a pretty big deal, as well as more on-hit damage on Toxic Shot. Then in 11.11, he got a 3-second shorter cooldown on his W. Then in 11.17, he got even more damage on Toxic Shot. Then in 11.21, he got a shorter cooldown on his Q, a longer blind duration, and significantly faster missile speed. Faster projectile means faster blind on faraway targets. Then in version 12.14, he received more mana per level, and his shrooms have a longer cast range, more AP scaling, and a lower mana cost. Excluding the backpedal in 724B, Teemo was buffed 12 consecutive times, some small and some big. Yet he still has a subpar win rate in solo queue and only a high pick rate in lower elos. Now let's take a look at Vegard. Vegard's more unique since he got a small rework in 5.4 and then a bigger one during the mage update in 6.9. Even so, he's another champion who got buffed over and over and still has a hard time keeping up with other champs. To keep things more uniform, let's look at 6.9 onwards. For all intents and purposes, the rework was a massive buff as it removed the conditionality of his ultimate scaling off the enemy champion's AP along with giving him potentially infinite ability power. Version 6.17 saw his passive AP stacking get 2 more AP on champion takedown. Then in 7.19 he got a shorter base cooldown on dark matter and the cooldown gets even shorter the more stacks of his passive you have. Then in 8.19, like Teemo, he got a lot of base mana, although looking back I think that was a universal change to mages. 9.19 reduced the cooldown of Event Horizon by 2 seconds at max rank. 10.6 gave him more base AD and 10 more base damage on his Q, making it easier for him to last in minions early on. Then in 10.16 he got 2 extra magic resist, okay? 11.4 his Q got a cheaper mana cost and his ultimate cooldown was reduced at rank 2 and 3. 12.2 gave his Q an even shorter cooldown and more AP stacking on cannon minions and monsters. Then 12.4 was the first nerf he got in like 6 years. Slightly lower base armor and 2 more seconds of cooldown on his E, which got extended again in 12.11. So he received 2 nerfs to Event Horizon last year. But then just recently in 13.4 they buffed the cast range on both his Q and W by a considerable amount, and one of Vegard's key weaknesses is his poor range. Not nearly as long of a string of buffs, but compared to where he was back then, you would think Vegard was massively power crept. Now unlike Teemo, Vegard did see more use over the years, but he still fails to maintain consistent success even though other champs go crazy on a lot less. Last one is Malphite, a well-known staple up in top lane. What sets him apart from the previous two is that he's actually played quite often, sporting about a 48% pick rate on average during his tenure, and his win rate is not too shabby all things considered. Even so, this wasn't without requiring a hefty number of buffs over the years. Starting in version 6.17, his W cooldown, passive armor ratio, and active armor ratio were all buffed. Then in 7.11, he got 10% more armor on his ground slime. Then in 719, he got a massive buff where if Granite Shield is active, the bonus armor on his W would triple, allowing him to reach monstrous amounts of armor late game, sometimes well over 800. 722 featured the same universal health increase. Then in 87, he got more attack damage, AP ratio on ground slam, and a lower cooldown on his ultimate. Then he got another massive buff in version 9.14, where his Q slow was amplified at the cost of less duration, and remember, Q takes the movement speed away from his opponent and adds it to him, so that means more speed for Malphite, resulting in a net positive. Brutal Strikes was renamed to Thunderclap, turning it into an empowered auto attack and changing the splash damage into a Titanic Hydro Cone, though its mana cost was effectively doubled. 915 gave more slow to his Q and more base damage on his W. 922 was the first nerf he would get, but in fairness that was directly aimed at AP Malphite, which had a few weeks to shine. Continuing on, he received a hotfix nerf to the base armor on his W and E, but once again that had more to do with the new mythic items being obscenely overpowered, not really him. 1112 ended up bringing that armor back to 15% from 10, as well as a bit more base damage. 1216 then reduced the cooldown on Granite Shield from 10 to 8 at level 1, helping out his laning phase, while Thunderclap's cooldown went down at later ranks. Then, 1219 decided to bring some of that AP scaling back into his kit, effectively reverting the nerf from 922. Then in 1023, his ground slam mana cost was reduced, the base damage was increased considerably, and the armor ratio even more so. Finally, in the same patch, they increased Vegard's cast range. Malphite's armor scaling increased for both the empowered auto and the accompanying buff after, followed by an even shorter cooldown on his W. Aside from those three, other champions experienced a similar gradual nudge throughout the years. Nasus, Caitlyn, Garen, Yorick, Alawi, Kassadin to some extent, Kayle, Lissandra, Olaf, at least before his rework, quite a number of them. What usually ends up happening is kind of a surface tension-like effect. Each individual buff appears to not matter that much, a little base damage here, maybe some cooldown reduction, higher stats and whatnot. But after a while, those buffs add up and eventually burst, causing the champion to become instant pick ban overnight. This actually happened a while ago with Udyr back in Season 11, right after Mythics came out. Prior to that, because he was so bad, Riot kept buffing him over and over and over to no avail, mostly his Phoenix stance. Between around 2017 to 2021, he had tons of positive number adjustments to his kit that once the Turbo Chem Tank meta rolled around, all those buffs finally came into fruition and catapulted Udyr into God mode territory, prompting him to get nerfed and then subsequently reworked into the juggernaut he is today. What exactly causes these champions to need these periodic maintenance type buffs? Adding on to that, what prevents them from going out of control when other champs will become obnoxious on far less? To start, I think we should look for any similarities between the aforementioned champs. Initially, since I thought Garen, Malphite, Nasus, Yorick, Udyr, and Olaf were included, I was gonna say stat checker, but then you have a few who aren't stat checkers like Caitlyn, Lissandra, and Kayle. Conversely, there are stat checkers like Trundle who get buffed and nerfed on a regular basis. Then I thought maybe it was the simplicity or linearity of their kit, but I would hardly call Teemo, Kayle, and Lissandra to be one-dimensional. A possible reason behind this could be that most, if not all, of those champions have mutually exclusive abilities. Or alternatively, buffing their abilities doesn't affect their existing condition. To elaborate, let's look at Nasus. All of his abilities have only one or two things that can scale, and that scaling doesn't really have any influence outside of the rest of the kit. His passive Q and W don't improve through items whatsoever, so if hypothetically his Q gained 20 more base damage, items that boost auto attack damage or have on-hit effects won't really change with that 20 extra damage, nor will they address any of the pre-existing flaws within the champion. The same holds true for the rest of his kit. They increased the attack speed cripple on Wither not too long ago, but Nasus was already effective against auto attack champs by virtue of his single target burst and dueling potential. It's not like Wither's increased attack speed will affect mages or ability casters in any capacity. Same goes to Fury of the Sands. When they added the property of his ultimate having the cooldown on his Q, all that did was increase his DPS, which does matter, but it doesn't address any of his core problems. If we go back to Teemo for a moment, none of the buffs he got address what makes him unpopular and or unsuccessful. A lower mana cost and cooldown on his mushrooms doesn't change the fact that once the enemy team gets Oracle Lens, they can disarm all of them. Or it doesn't change that Teemo has to preemptively place them around the map to apply any meaningful pressure. Furthermore, it doesn't do anything to deter the enemy team from jumping on his ass at the earliest convenience. For Vegard, no matter how fast they make his stacks or how low the cooldown on his W is, it doesn't change the fact that it's still hard to land his W on a target that isn't stunned, and he still gets wiped out by anyone with rushdown or sniped by anyone with long range. For Malphite, increasing the armor ratios, the base damage, lowering the cooldown, mana cost, and whatnot doesn't change the fact that he still gets destroyed by magic damage and has no hard CC or engage potential outside of his ultimate. So in a way, we can draw the conclusion that these champions are linear in nature, even if they do have the potential to hypercarry games if played correctly. On that note, I think what causes a champion to receive buffs yet not change too much if at all, is how their abilities intertwine with the rest of their kit. For example, let's compare Caitlyn to Vars for a moment. The former's built over Peacemaker is a long-range, piercing shot that does heavy damage to the first enemy hit. Afterwards, however, the bullet expands to cover more horizontal area but deals only half damage to subsequent targets, unless they're rooted by Yodel's Snap Trap. It's not too different from Vars' piercing arrow, which also does a lot of damage to the first enemy but less to those behind him. The only difference is, Vars has an immediate burst element through Blighted Quiver, where he can deal serious % health damage on a target with blight stacks on top of missing health damage when activating W. Therefore, reducing the cooldown on Vars' Q is more impactful than reducing the cooldown on Caitlyn's Q, because there are more things at play than just a bit more damage. Another way to look at it would be to check if the champion has multiple forms of scaling in their kit that can be affected by certain metrics, like Dr. Mundo. Mundo has a tendency to go out of control due to the way he scales with health. Say we were to increase the missing health gain from his ultimate from 15 to 25 to 20 to 30. An extra 5% wouldn't seem like all that much, but the health boost augments the total healing from his ultimate, the healing from his passive, the healing from his W because he gets more health and can therefore take more damage, the damage from the W recast, the passive AD boost from his E, and the bonus damage from the active. So many things get indirectly stronger because of one small metric. The same goes to the cooldown on maximum dosage. If it was reduced from 120 seconds down to 100, that would give him more opportunities to go Super Saiyan and boost his damage and durability respectively. Comparatively, the buff to Malphite's Granite Shield back in version 7.19 may seem like overkill. Going from 35% bonus armor to 90 would be absurd if it were on any other champion. But the caveat is that Granite Shield has to be active for this to take effect. Malphite has a rather unique problem where, being an anti-AD champion, he wants to build as much armor as possible. However, the items that yield the most armor don't give a lot of health, like Frozen Heart, Gargoyle, and Thornmail. Vice versa, any item that gives a ton of health hardly gives any armor or none at all, like Warmox. So if he builds armor, his Granite Shield crumbles to pieces very quickly, but if he builds health, the bonus armor isn't as effective. That being said, it's interesting how some champions get buff after buff and still remain more or less in the same position they were before. Even more curious is that there's no obvious trend of that occurrence. Hecarim is for the most part just as one-dimensional as the likes of Malphite, Olaf and such, yet a small change to him is enough to skyrocket him from 5% to a 20% play rate. In version 11.11, 11.12, and 11.20, he received a series of minute buffs to his AD scaling, armor, and regen, yet that was enough to make him public enemy number 1, prompting a nerf in 12.6 that greatly reduced the base damage on his Q and E. A few weeks later, they tried to bring him back by amplifying the bonus AD on his Q and the reduced cooldown of his W. Then in 12.17, even though it looks like there's a lot on screen, it's not actually a whole lot all things considered. He gains bonus armor and magic resist on his W, but that was compensated by a higher cooldown on W and lower base armor and health. The ramping power of his Q is compensated by a lower base damage and the need to stack his Q 3 times instead of 2. Also, they lowered the AD scaling on his E, as well as a knockback, and evened out the cooldown, as well as a shorter fear duration on his ultimate. All in all, these changes were a net neutral for him, or at best, a slight net positive. Yet in 12.18 and 12.23, he got slammed really hard. It's something I find interesting, and to be honest, I don't have a hard grasp on the answer for why some champions remain weak or unpopular no matter how many times they get buffed, while others go crazy with just a tiny bit of legroom. It might just be a matter of circumstance. For Nasus and Vegard, you can make an argument their stacking mechanics were made faster to help them keep up with the faster pace of the game. For Malphite, it may just be due to the overabundance of tank busting items now compared to before. But yeah, that's something I've been looking into for a while now. Time after time, I notice a champion getting buffs, but not really moving up the tier list in any way, at least in higher elo. What about you guys? Do you think there's a better explanation for why members of the cast have been significantly power creeped from their version years ago but remain in the same spot? Let me know in the comments down below. I guess this topic was more theory crafting or speculative than it was analytical, but I had a fun time writing it, and I hope you enjoyed as well. If you have, don't forget to leave a like and sub to the channel. Also follow me on Twitter at Vars, join my Discord server, and check out my other discussion videos if you haven't yet. But till next time, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you again soon in the next one. Take care.